up on this Friday edition of Newsline at noon, a Malaysia Airlines passenger jet with almost 300 people on board crashes after being shot down over the rebel-held eastern Ukraine. Korea will open up its rice market next year, but vows to maintain the highest possible tariffs to protect local farmers. Plus, Israel launches a ground assault on Gaza after 10 days of airstrikes failed to stop Hamas firing rockets. Hamas says Israel will have to pay a heavy price. These stories and more on Newsline at noon. It's noon Friday, July 18th here in Korea. Thanks for tuning in. Live from Seoul, I'm Eujin Chu.
It's very good to have you with us. I'm Mark Broom. Our top story this lunchtime, the world is still reeling after a Malaysia Airlines passenger plane carrying 298 people was shot down over eastern Ukraine, killing everyone on board.
Now, pro-Russian separatists are suspected of the missile attack, which Ukraine has branded an act of terrorism. Hyun-bin reports.
The Malaysian Airlines aircraft, a Boeing 777, was flying from Amsterdam to Kuala Lumpur when it fell near the city of Donetsk, a restive area close to the Russian border, which has become a stronghold for pro-Russian rebels. Ukraine's Interior Ministry advisor says the plane, which was flying at 33,000 feet, was brought down by a ground-to-air missile. Both the Ukrainian government and the pro-Russian separatist rebels immediately blamed each other for the crash.
We do not exclude the possibility that this plane was also shot down and stressed that Ukrainian Armed Forces did not perform any actions to fire at targets in the air.
Russian President Vladimir Putin is blaming the Ukrainian government for the crash, saying that Kiev bears some responsibility for the fighting that may have led to the jet's apparent downing by missile. The U.S. government says it will offer any assistance necessary to Ukraine to determine the cause of the crash.
I offered President Poroshenko the help of our expertise, our National Transportation Safety Group and other experts in the community. He accepted that help, and they will be on their way rapidly to see if we can get to the bottom of this.
More than half of those on board were Dutch nationals. There were also 27 Australians, 23 Malaysians, 11 Indonesians, and various other nationalities. More than 40 remain unverified. Korea's foreign ministry says it's unlikely any Korean passengers were on the plane. Other airlines have announced they are now diverting flights around eastern Ukraine. Hyun-bin, Arirang News.
Now, in less than 5 months, Malaysia Airlines has been faced with two disasters. Flight 370, which vanished from radar in March, remains missing to this day, with more questions than answers about its ultimate fate. And now the downing of Flight 17 with nearly 300 people on board. Our Kim Min-ji reports on the recent tragedies and another from more than 30 years ago that is shockingly reminiscent.
Mystery still surrounds Malaysia Airlines Flight 370 that went missing back in March, with still no sign of any wreckage or the 239 people who were on board. The Boeing jetliner en route from Kuala Lumpur to Beijing is believed to have crashed somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Despite massive international search efforts, the accident still remains unsolved, and investigators appear no closer to determining what happened to the plane than they were 4 months ago. And now another tragedy involving a Malaysia Airlines flight, this one shot down, killing everyone on board. Malaysian Prime Minister Najib Razak says the attack was a shock and ordered an immediate investigation. In the span of less than 5 months, some 530 people have been killed while flying on Malaysia Airlines planes. It puts the future of the company in question. The crisis also brings to mind a similar attack from 3 decades earlier. In September 1983, Korean Airlines Flight 007 bound for Seoul from New York was shot down by a Soviet fighter plane, killing all 269 people on board. The attack came during the peak of the Cold War and further heightened tensions between the West and the Soviet Union. The Korean airliner was shot down after being mistaken as a reconnaissance plane. The downing of the Malaysia Airlines Flight 17 and the deaths of nearly 300 innocent lives appears to also be the result of tensions between states. Kim Min-ji, Arirang News.
And moving on, the Korean government has announced it will liberalize the nation's rice market starting next year. It was a decision that came after much deliberation and has been met with fierce resistance from farmers' unions within the country. Hwang Jie has the details.
Korea will open its rice market next year. Agriculture Minister Lee Dong-pil said Friday that it's simply too costly to import more rice, which was the trade-off for postponing rice market liberalization. Korea promised to open up its rice market under a 1994 agreement with the World Trade Organization. But because rice is a Korean staple food, the country was allowed to push back the date for 20 years in exchange for gradually raising its rice import quota. That extension is set to expire at the end of this year. The minister set the import quota of over 400,000 tons this year, which makes up nearly 10% of the nation's total rice consumption, is a heavy burden on the nation's overall rice market, especially as rice consumption continues to drop in Korea. If the government were to ask the WTO for another delay, the import quota would likely double next year. While the government says it will protect the nation's rice market by imposing high tariffs on foreign rice, it did not provide specific numbers. Pundits are expecting the tariff rate to fall at around 400%. They say that level of tariff will ensure Korean rice maintains its price competitiveness against Chinese or American rice, which can cost half the price or even lower. Outside from where the government made the announcement, a massive protest led by Korean farmers was held. They said they intended to protect the nation's food sovereignty that the government seems to have handed away. The government plans to set the nation's tariff rate on rice and get it verified by the WTO by this September. It also laid out plans to support the nation's rice industry through insurance programs meant to stabilize rural household incomes. Hwang Jie, Arirang News.
South Korea and China are making slow but steady progress in bilateral free trade talks. Their 12th round of negotiations have just wrapped up in the Korean city of Daegu, with Korea's trade ministry saying the two sides reached an agreement in principle on market liberalization in the service and investment sectors. Significant inroads were also made in the areas of online commerce and cooperation. As for the sensitive agriculture industry, the two sides are still narrowing differences. Seoul wants as many agricultural products as possible included in the extremely sensitive items list to protect the market from an influx of cheap Chinese products. The next round of negotiations is set for September in China. In summit talks in Seoul earlier this month, Presidents Park Geun-hye and Xi Jinping agreed to finalize the bilateral trade pact by the end of the year.
Now, working-level talks to discuss the fine details of North Korea's participation in the upcoming Asian Games that will take place in South Korea in September came to an abrupt end on Thursday when the North Korean delegation just stormed out of the room. And on Friday, a day later, the North accused the South of acting in bad faith during those negotiations. Our Hwang Sang-hee reports.
North Korea threatened Friday to reconsider its decision to participate in the upcoming Incheon Asian Games, pinning the failure of Thursday's working-level talks squarely on the South. Through its state-run Korean Central News Agency Friday, the North criticized the South Korean delegation for what it called an insincere attitude in the latter half of the meeting, claiming it came under the directive of the presidential office of Cheongwade. It accused the South of taking issue with the number of North Korean cheerleaders and the size of the North Korean flag that would be used during the Games. Should Seoul maintain such a stance, Pyongyang threatened to reconsider its plans to participate in the sporting event. South Korea's Unification Ministry expressed deep regrets about North Korea's angry outburst and called for Pyongyang to return to talks with sincerity. The two Koreas met at the border village of Panmunjom on Thursday to discuss the details of the 700 North Korean athletes and cheerleaders that were planning to make the trip south for the Incheon Asian Games, which begin in September. But when South Korea asked for more details on its plans and said it would accommodate the North Korean delegation just as it would any other team that's participating in the Games, North Korea walked away, questioning Seoul's motives. The two sides have not set a date for their next meeting. While some experts had hoped the Asian Games could become a platform for improved inter-Korean ties, Thursday's meeting shows that the two sides still remain far apart. Hwang Sang-hee, Arirang News.
Now, on to another North Korea-related story, and the United Nations Security Council has denounced North Korea's recent series of short-range ballistic missile tests. Officials say the fact the Security Council has even addressed this issue so quickly shows how seriously the international community views this situation. Choi Yu-sun reports.
Following a closed-door meeting on Thursday, the United Nations Security Council called on North Korea to stop its recent series of short-range ballistic missile tests.
The members of the Security Council condemned these launches as violations of Security Council resolutions 1718 in 2006, 1874, 2009, 2087, 2013 and 2094, 2013, and urged the DPRK to fully comply with the relevant Security Council resolutions.
The Council's condemnation comes after Pyongyang launched 3 rounds of Scud short-range ballistic missiles between June 29th and July 13th toward the East Sea of the Korean Peninsula. For conducting 3 nuclear tests and repeatedly testing its short to long-range ballistic missiles since 2006, North Korea has been banned by the UN from any type of ballistic missile or nuclear-related activity. The Council had previously released a statement denouncing the North's medium-range Nodong missile launch in March. South Korean officials say it's very unusual for the Security Council to discuss the regime's short-range missile testing.
It's meaningful that the Council and not the North Korea Sanctions Committee discussed the issue after recognizing that the frequent short-range missiles on the Korean Peninsula were threatening international peace and security.
Pyongyang is expected to protest the latest statement out of the United Nations. In response to the statement in March, North Korea threatened to carry out what it called a new form of nuclear test. Choi Yu-sun, Arirang News.
The United Nations Human Rights Committee has lambasted Japan for not taking more responsibility for its past atrocities. The committee, during its regular 2-day review of Japan's human rights situation, said the Japanese government hadn't gone far enough in apologizing for its sexual enslavement of women before and during World War II. The UN committee also said the female victims should be called enforced sex slaves, instead of using what it called the rather vague term of comfort women. The recommendation, analysts say, implies that the committee acknowledges the need for a clearer term for the victims to show that they were forced into wartime brothels by the Japanese military. Now, we're going to connect live to our news centre, where our Eunice Kim is standing by with the big development happening today in the Middle East.
Eunice, after 10 days of aerial assaults, Israel has now dispatched ground troops into Gaza.
That's right, Jinju. The ground operation began around 10 p.m. on Thursday local time. That's about 4 in the morning here in Korea. A statement from the Israeli military said the operation will be open-ended and cover multiple fronts. In addition to the existing aerial and naval assaults, it will include a large force comprised of infantry, armored corps, engineer corps, artillery, and intelligence teams. We're also hearing the Israeli cabinet approved more reservists, some 18,000 of them, to boost the 48,000 reserve soldiers already called up, many of whom had been on standby at the Gaza border in recent days. Now here's Prime Minister Netanyahu's spokesman explaining the reason behind the escalated offensive.
The only reason there is combat tonight, the only reason that the Israeli government had to send in troops is because Hamas rejected the ceasefire proposals that were put on the table by the Egyptians.
The fighting had resumed following Thursday's 5-hour-long ceasefire called for by the United Nations. Palestinian health officials had said at least 233 Palestinians were killed before the boots were sent in. Israel says it is responding to the rockets Hamas has been firing its way, now numbering more than 1,300.
And Eunice, the Israeli military says it wants to destroy these tunnels that it says Hamas has dug out of the Gaza Strip right into Israel. And this is where they say Palestinian militants are launching these rocket attacks on Israel, right?
That's right, and reports say it was before dawn on Thursday that about a dozen Palestinian fighters actually succeeded in reaching an Israeli community, and an Israeli military said it bombarded that group, killing at least one, and they'll continue to target such tunnels as well as other infrastructure it sees as a threat. Meanwhile, Gaza health officials reporting that the ground operation has already claimed civilian lives, including a 3-month-old boy who died after a shell hit his family's tent in southern Gaza. They said the body was evacuated on a donkey cart because ambulances simply couldn't reach the area due to the heavy shelling. Now, no time frame has been set for this new operation, but more civilian casualties likely will heat up international pressure calling for a ceasefire. Moving on to Afghanistan now, rocket fire in the country's main international air hub as election workers began a recount of votes in the country's contested presidential runoff last month. Militants struck the airport in the pre-dawn hours from 2 unfinished buildings to the north, setting off a gun battle with security forces on the ground. Afghanistan's Interior Ministry spokesman said the airport was reopened after 4 fighters were killed by police special forces. This as UN and American election observers are in the capital city to monitor an audit of the vote that both candidates Abdullah and Ashraf Ghani had called fraud-ridden. It's part of a deal mediated by U.S. Secretary of State John Kerry as a NATO-led combat mission there is set to soon formally end. The elections is Afghanistan's first democratic transfer of power. Microsoft has begun what's anticipated to be the largest layoff in the software giant's 39-year history. Up to 18,000 jobs, or 14% of the company's workforce, are projected to be slashed in the next year. The move comes 5 months into CEO Satya Nadella's tenure as Microsoft tries to reshape itself into a more cloud computing and mobile-friendly company. Little is known about where those job cuts will be, though its newly acquired Nokia phone division is expected to be cut by nearly half. And finally, not that we didn't know, but a report seals it, the world is getting warmer. According to an annual State of the Climate report, which observes weather events and scientific data collected over the year, 2013 was one of the top 10 hottest years on record, observing historic highs in greenhouse gas emissions, rise in sea surface temperatures, and ice melts in both the Arctic and the Antarctic. Australia experienced its warmest year on record, followed by Argentina and New Zealand, which had their second and third warmest, respectively.
Stay up to date on the latest news out of Korea. Connecting to our team of reporters about the issues that matter to Korea. On air, on your mobile, online. Find out more about Korea on Newsline at Noon with Mark Broom and Jin-ju.
I'm Jin-ju. Market researcher, strategy analytics, said Thursday that LG Electronics brought in about...
Another body was recovered from the sunken Soto ferry early Friday morning. The government's disaster response team said divers found the body inside the cafeteria of the vessel at around 6:20 a.m. Korea time. The body is presumed to be that of a woman in her 50s who was a cook on the ill-fated ship. It marks the first body recovered from the Soto ferry in over 3 weeks. Officials say they will continue all-out efforts to find the 10 remaining bodies as the tidal currents have begun to slow down. The finding raises the confirmed death toll to 294. South Korea's new finance minister says the economy is headed down an uncharted path in relation to the challenges it's facing. In his first economic ministerial meeting since taking office, Choi Kyung-hwan said there was an urgent need for comprehensive and aggressive measures to address lingering problems like slumping household income and sluggish investment due to a lack of entrepreneurship. Choi added that the economy is recovering at a much weaker pace than expected and that the momentum could wane at any moment.
Now, in tech news, the global smart home market is forecast to double over the next 5 years, driven mostly by demand in the US. Market research firm Strategy Analytics says that 26% of broadband households in the world will have at least one smart home system by the year 2019. It says revenues in the US will account for nearly 40% of the global total in 2014, with more than 20 million households spending billions of dollars on smart home systems. Growth in the US is being fueled by the entrance of corporations like Apple, Google and Samsung. The research firm says the smart home industry is set to become a major market opportunity for technology and service providers over the next 5 years. Now, many of our viewers will have heard of Bororo and or Lava. Well, if you haven't, you soon will, because Korea's most popular animated cartoon characters are winning over countless fans, both young and old, around the world. And they're taking home plenty of awards as well around the world. And riding on this wave, Korea has pulled out all the stops for its largest character fair that's currently underway right here in Seoul. Park Ji-won reports.
This adorable feline character is one of the most popular emoticons on Korea's mobile messaging application KakaoTalk. It's been downloaded more than 1 million times since it was first introduced in 2012. If cats aren't your thing, how about a sleep-loving sloth? This sloth character embodies the slow life that some of us might miss in this busy modern society we live in. It would be remiss if we didn't mention Bororo, perhaps the most widely recognizable Korean character worldwide. The children's animation has been exported to some 130 countries since it debuted in the early 2000s. Following in the lovable penguin's tracks is Larva, another successful character that now has a presence in 105 countries.
It doesn't have any language, it doesn't have any dialogue. It's a simple slapstick comedy that everybody easy to understand, so I think that's the main reason.
From instant messenger emoticons to healing icons, Korea's character industry is expanding rapidly. In just 6 years, the export volume of Korean characters has more than doubled, and from 2010 to 2012, the export volume grew at an average growth rate over 22% every year.
Well, I've been visiting Korea since the early 1990s in the licensing business. I've really seen the industry grow and become a very mature, and it's really grown to world-class level, particularly with a lot of the innovative properties.
I think there's definitely a maturing of the licensing market here. People are more aware of the value of an effective strategic licensing program, how it could help create more awareness for their brand or their character, and how it could also help them create a significant revenue stream.
All these characters and many others can be found at the Seoul Character and Licensing Fair being held at COEX through this Sunday. Park Ji-won, Arirang News.
Good afternoon, I'm Lee Ji-hyun with your weather update. Well, downpours hit Seoul and the surrounding areas this morning, but it let up earlier than we expected. But the rain clouds now have moved to southern areas, dropping showers to regions down south. Well, it's going to be much cooler today, though, while monsoon rain and clouds has dropped the temperatures to relatively lower than what we've had lately, remaining upper 20s, and all the rain is forecasted to clear up up later in the afternoon. So please keep this in mind, and let's take a closer look at the readings for today. The high in Seoul will rise to 27, while Daegu will reach 31, and Gwangju and Busan will top out at 28 this afternoon. And for other regions, Jeju Island and Daejeon and Dokdo should all see a high of 28. Well, it will rain again tomorrow morning here in Seoul, but it should let up in the afternoon. So if you're planning any outdoor activities this weekend, Sunday seems to be a better day, but it's going to be quite hot. Well, drive safely in heavy rain today. Now that's all for Korea, and here's the international weather for viewers around the world.
Okay, well, those are the stories we're following at this hour.
Have a great weekend. Mark and I'll be back at the same time on Monday. Thank you for watching.